Welcome to this interactive session with Professor Ori Soltes on Hizmet's philosophy of dialogue. Ori Soltes is a professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization, Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. He teaches across a range of disciplines. As co-founding director of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, he has spent 20 years focused on the issue of Nazi-plundered art. Soltes has authored and edited 19 books and scores of articles and exhibition catalogue essays. Recent volumes include Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, Mysticism in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Searching for Oneness, Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, Magic and Religion in the Greco-Roman World, The Beginnings of Judaism and Christianity, and God and the Goalposts, A Brief History of Sports, Religion, Politics, War, and Art. You're welcome, Professor Soltes. It's an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining us. And you have up to 2 hours for this session, but I know that you have to leave early a little bit. So over to you, sir, however you like to conduct this session.
Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I wish I could see all of you, but some of you are afraid and have your visuals turned off. But that's okay. I realized halfway through the semester last year, when we were the entire year online, all classes were Zoom, and I realized I was feeling so fatigued in a way that I don't ordinarily, and I realized it was because everyone kept their cameras off, or almost everyone. So it was like talking to a wall. And when I said that to my students, they said, "Oh my God, Professor, I didn't realize that." And boom, 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 suddenly all their cameras were on. So a critical mass of you have your cameras on. I assume the most beautiful amongst you have your cameras on, and those who are not have their cameras off. That's just a guess, you know. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you. Good morning to me, good evening to you. And to talk about dialogue, I will begin with a kind of broad context, and I imagine that some of the things I say will be familiar to you, but maybe some of them won't. And in any case, they're things that bear repeating and thinking about. When I think of dialogue in the Western tradition, the starting point is always Socrates, whom we see engaged again and again and again in dialogues with various and sundry individuals, most often individuals who are called sophists, from the Greek word sophos, meaning wise, because they consider themselves to be wise. They consider themselves to know. And what Socrates is constantly engaged in doing is asking them questions about issues and ideas that they claim to be experts on, like what is good, what is truth, what is justice, what is piety, what is holiness. And it turns out almost inevitably that when he starts to dig into them with questions, they start to fumble, and they begin to realize that, well, some of them do realize, some of them walk away before they acknowledge that they realize that they don't really know what truth is, or what justice is, or what piety or holiness is. And I suppose part of the reason for that is that those are concepts that, well, it's not easy for us to know. And the point and the purpose of Socrates engaging in dialogue with them in the first place is not to teach them what these concepts mean, because he claims right up front that he does not himself know. He claims, in fact, that if the Delphic oracle pronounced him the wisest of the Greeks, and he thought and he thought and he thought and he thought about why I would be considered wise, he said, I realized suddenly that I'm the only one who knows that I don't know. Other people claim to know, they think they know, but they don't, but I at least know that I don't know. And what that means is that I'm constantly engaged in thinking, in trying to figure out what it means to think and what these concepts are, without ever arriving at a firm and absolute conclusion that says, I now know what truth is, I now know what justice is. So the message of Socratic dialogue is the message of ongoing inquiry. It's the message of ongoing investigation. It's the message of ongoing examination. The unexamined life is not worth living is a phrase that is associated with him. And it's about thinking. The interesting thing, however, about Socratic dialogue is that in a certain fundamental sense, it's false dialogue, because every Socratic dialogue that we have, of course, was not written down by Socrates, it was written down by Plato. And we are never quite certain whether Plato is recording, give or take, genuine dialogues between Socrates and his interlocutors, or whether he is presenting them in an idealized way as they might have taken place, could have taken place, but not necessarily as they took place. And the advantage and the disadvantage of Plato's doing this is that the figure whom Socrates has a conversation with always responds with the sort of answer that makes it possible for Socrates to move on to the next point, and always asks the kind of question that enables Socrates to move on to the next point. So did Euthyphro actually say piety or holiness is what's pleasing to the gods, or did he actually say this or that enables Socrates to say, well, pleasing to the gods, but we know the gods disagree about things, because we've all read Homer and we've all read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and we all have seen how the gods argue with each other and how they have their human favorites and are against each other and against the humans they don't like and for the humans they do like. So clearly they don't agree on everything. So can we know, if we define holiness or piety as what's pleasing to the gods, what pleases all of them? And of course, the Greeks have many gods and goddesses. So it's an obvious sort of question. But the question is, for us, does Euthyphro say what Plato represents him saying to Socrates that enables Socrates to say what he says? So there's a certain sense in which Socratic dialogue is an ideal, but placed in the context of Plato's writing out the Socratic dialogues, it's not real, because Plato is writing both sides, or at least we can't know for certain how real it is. And of course, for classicists, the questions become at a certain point, does Plato take the form of the dialogue? Because it proves to be a very effective teaching form. Because if he represents two guys in conversation, or sometimes more than two, then you, the listener, or you, the reader, are likely to get kind of more involved with one side or the other. And you're thinking, what would I say? What would I say? Rather than getting a lecture straight out, frontal, at you, to which you more passively respond. So the form, in any case, works well as an educational instrument. And as a technical matter, and as I suppose a philosophical matter, we can still ask the question, at a certain point, does Plato continue to use that form, even though, and he's using Socrates as his main character, even though he's now talking about things that Socrates actually never talked about? In the long run, of course, that question, which is an interesting and important one, is less important than the issues that Plato's Socrates is represented as raising, and the form in which the discussion appears that tries to engage the student. That is one form of dialogue, and it's one set of issues that pertains to the matter of dialogue. But if I fast forward 24 centuries and come to the 1920s, and I come to this German Jewish philosopher by the name of Martin Buber, his seminal work, his most important work, he wrote on a lot of topics, actually, but the one for which he is most well known is the work that he wrote called I, Thou. And I should point out in parenthesis that German has two ways of saying you. English has one, you. Well, English before the modern era had two ways, you and thou. Thou, I think, we tend to use today if we are trying to refer to a kind of biblical context and it has a formal religious sensibility, whereas you is more everyday language. But what's interesting is the German du, which is informal, singular. So if I'm speaking to someone who is a friend, I'll use du. If I'm speaking to someone I don't really know or someone who is my superior in some way, shape, or form, I'll use Sie, which is also the form that I use for the plural. So if I'm speaking to all of you in German, I'm going to say Sie. So Buber's work is called Ich und Du, I and then how do you translate the du? So most translators render it as thou, but the paradox for me is that makes it more formal, and in a way, I think his intention is to be informal. That's not the point. The point is his work is about dialogue. And he talks about two ways of being in the world. One way is called I, thou, as if it's one word, I dash thou. And the other way is called I dash it. Two ways of being in the world. And he says, I, thou is to have a relationship with everything and everyone around you. I, thou is a relationship such that I always recognize that as you are a thou to my I am a thou to your I, so that it is a kind of reciprocal, constant circle of recognition of our equality as beings who can therefore relate as such. It does not engender relationships, it engenders experiences. I experience you as an it. I experience you for my purposes. It is I who am all that is my concern. If you will forgive a topical reference, Donald Trump has never in his entire existence, I'm reasonably sure, engaged in I-thou relationships. He only has the capacity to engage in I-it experiences. Everything revolves around him. It's about him. And with whomever he has what he might call a relationship, it is one that serves his needs, his purposes. It never occurs to him that the person on the other side of that is actually a person with an I. So Buber distinguishes I-thou relationships from I-it experiences. And his goal, of course, is to guide us to I-thou, which is what he calls a life of dialogue. To truly be in dialogue with someone is to be an I-thou relationship. If it's I-it, then that's not a relationship and that's not truly a dialogue. And he says we're not always, and we can't always, because we're imperfect beings, we can't always be in I-thou relationships, but that's the goal, as much as possible to be so. And he goes further than that. In this work, he goes on to discuss different ways in which we communicate with different forms of I-thou relations. So interhuman connections, interhuman relations, interhuman I-thou dialogues are governed essentially by language. As I'm speaking now, as if you were speaking back to me, we'd be using language. Obviously, it can be verbal. If we include sign language, it can be visual and not verbal, or it can be a combination. But language is our primary instrument. But he says you can have an I-thou relationship with all of nature. You can have I-thou relations with your dog, with your cat, with a tree, with my pet rock. People have pet rocks, or at least they used to. I don't know, sometimes. And in that case, of course, it's not a verbal relationship. There's something that transcends the verbal. It's true. You may talk to your cat or your dog. You may talk to your trees and your pet rock, but you're not expecting a verbal response on the order that you would get if you're having a dialogue with another human being. So this not secondary at all, second mode of I-thou is nonverbal. And he says there's a third kind. It involves God. Now, Buber comes out of an existentialist background, which means he comes out of a background which doubts seriously the very existence of God. The existentialist perspective is that God is either non-existent or irrelevant to human existence. We're on our own, and we can figure it out ultimately by ourselves. We don't need God. Buber's I-thou is a work of religious existentialism, a kind of paradox, because what he says is this: where God is concerned, as with the rest of nature, language as I use it vis-a-vis humans may or may not be the way in which I communicate, but there's a more profound and fundamental issue, which is my doubting God's very presence. But one of the key features of existentialist thought that actually in the history of Western philosophy comes into play with thinkers like Hegel and Kant, even before we get to existentialism, is the notion of the will, the human will that is dominant in human existence. So Buber says this: I can, by an act of will, will myself to suspend my disbelief in God's presence for a moment. And if I do that, I'll find God on the other side of the table in conversation with me. I'm paraphrasing him. So he takes the very instrument that existentialist philosophy uses to assert the lack of need for God, and turns it around and says that instrument can be used to bring God into a dialogue relationship, an I-thou relationship with me. So it's a profound leap, of course. And what Buber has in mind then overall in this discussion, whether we're talking about human to human relations, human to tree relations, or human to divine relations, is a sense of relationship that is informed by this I-thou consciousness, which means a consciousness always not only of what I am to myself and what I want you to think of me, but what you are to yourself and what you want to think of me, and to repeat a very consistent sense of reciprocity. Which brings me to a third kind of aspect of this discussion of dialogue, which is dialogue as it pertains to religion, because that is an area that has become of particular importance, I would say, in the last 75 years within the West and increasingly across the world. And when I think of religious dialogue, I recognize that there are two kinds. And I don't mean I, thou, and I, it. I mean more simply false and true. So if we take, let's say, an example of Jewish-Christian dialogue, just to choose two out of, and obviously any number of combinations. False dialogue is when I sit down as a Jew with my Christian counterpart, and I have as my intention, and she has as her intention, ultimately, to convince me, to convert me, to make me realize that hers is the true faith, my intention to make her realize that mine is the true faith. So we think we're having a dialogue. It's a false dialogue because its intention is conversionary. Its intention is not truly open to listen. It's to make my points. If I go back to Socrates, his point is not to make his points except the point of you should be thinking about these things more. If I go back to Buber, his point is always clearly to be aware of the person on the other side, but he's thinking in the broadest of terms, not only and necessarily in the case of religion, he just means in relations in general. But with the specifics of religious dialogue, two practitioners of two different faiths who sit down and either or both have or has as an underlying intention, it may be an unconscious intention, to convert the other to his, her perspective, is engaging in a kind of false dialogue. True dialogue, which is the opposite, is truly open dialogue. It's genuinely listening dialogue. It is being in a situation where, as you and I converse about our respective faiths, it's not just that our intention is just to learn about each other's faiths. It's also in thinking and talking about my faith, perhaps to learn a little bit more about my faith than I thought I knew before. And it's to be in a position, and not everyone can find this position, where I am 100% comfortable and convinced that my faith is the most perfect on the planet for me, which has no contradiction from the notion that your faith is the most perfect on the planet for you. Again, it suggests a kind of paradox, because I'm suggesting that 100% plus 100% equals 100%, which in ordinary arithmetic terms won't work. But we're dealing with the reality, of course, that transcends ordinary arithmetic terms when we are dealing with religion, which after all deals with the concept, divinity, which is by definition other than humanity, and therefore concerning which, excuse me, concerning which I can never, in the arithmetic sense, know about. Everything I say about divinity, I say as a metaphor, as an allegory, as an analogy. If I say God is all good, God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is interested, engaged, involved in human affairs, anything I say about God, I'm saying based on my understanding of those terms, which derive from my human experience, my human understanding. I cannot know in the same sense that perhaps I can know that if I put 2 fingers and 2 fingers, count them up, I get 4. I can't know about God in the same way. So anything and everything I say about God is a kind of metaphor and involves a kind of leap to the belief, the conclusion, the assumption that what I'm saying makes a certain amount of sense where God is concerned. And of course, it's more complicated than that, because God is not only absolutely, utterly other than what humans are, but at the same time, every religious tradition in one form or another believes that there is a bit of God in each and every one of us. We can call it Atman, we can call it soul, we can call it neshama, we can call it nafs. There are all kinds of terms in every language that we can use to refer to that which in some sense is a bit of God within us, or so we believe, or so we imagine, or so we assume. But if that's true, then in some sense, we're every one of us, at least a little bit like God. And God must be a little bit like us. And yet at the same time, God is completely, absolutely, utterly other than what we are. There are some traditions, of course, that look at that whole matrix of issues and in a sense address it by way of the conviction that God assumes human form at some point, at some time, in some place, for important purposes having to do with divine human relations. So front and center, obviously, is Christianity, for which God assumes human form and becomes the human known as Jesus of Nazareth. Parenthesis, even within Christianity, not every Christian denomination accepts that notion. So the Armenian Church, for example, believes that God remains only and purely spiritual, God the Father. Jesus is a kind of illusion in terms of his physicality. So Armenian religion is called monophysite, which is Greek meaning one nature, because God's true nature is only spiritual. It's only divine. Jesus' nature, is only spiritual, only divine. The physical nature of Jesus is an illusion necessary for Jesus to accomplish what he's got to accomplish. So even within the body of a particular form of faith, for which the divine human interface achieves this unique situation, not everyone embraces that understanding. Of course, Christianity is not the only instance in which we find this notion. So one has in what we rather inaccurately call Hinduism, as if it's one monolithic form of faith, the understanding of some that the manifestation of God, known as Vishnu, at a certain point, among other forms that he takes the form that is human, of Krishna. And of course, there are those who develop, yes, I am going to get to Hizmet, do not worry. And there are those who understand Krishna as the preeminent expression of God, as told in the Bhagavad Gita. So the question of dialogue within the context of religion is a complex one and a simple one. Can I have a true dialogue by engaging with others, not with an intention to convert, but with a conviction both that mine and their forms of faith are simultaneously perfect? And we see this most eminently expressible in the mystical tradition, it seems to me, because the mystic wants to empty him, herself of self in order to be filled with God. And if I empty myself of self, I'm likely to become aware that the notion that my form of faith is the only correct form of faith is my ego speaking and not God speaking. So within the Muslim tradition, for example, we find this very explicitly in Ibn Arabi and Rumi. Let me just read you a couple of passages from Ibn Arabi and Rumi. Ibn Arabi writes, "My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idol sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tablets of the Torah, the pages of the Quran, because my creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith." And on the other hand, Rumi says, "I go into the Muslim mosque, the Jewish synagogue, the Christian church, I see one altar, or elsewhere, not Christian or Jew or Muslim nor Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the east or the west, nor out of the ocean or up from the ground, nor natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist, am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and live in any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul, because all of those are human terms and human concepts. And when Rumi speaks filled with God, it's God itself speaking through him." So Fethullah Gulen, who among other things became a very important student of Ibn Arabi, of Rumi, of Sufism, who became an important student, in fact, of the complete range of Muslim teachings, from the legalistic and the jurisprudential to the mystical, versed in Quran, versed in the account of the lives of the Prophet Muhammad, versed in Hadith, versed in the lives of the 10,000 saints, versed in everything of that ilk. Himself not formally trained, much beyond elementary school, but gifted with a photographic memory, a hafiz, meaning someone, as you probably all know, who had committed the entire Quran to memory by the age of 9, or other sources say 10, or other sources say 11. But the point is, he was fairly young and he had already committed the Quran to memory. The story has it that when he would go out shepherding the family flocks, he would take books from his father's library and he'd read them and commit them to memory. So he's gifted with that kind of memory. And, you know, you can have that sort of a memory, and therefore I can throw all sorts of facts and tell me it was on page 41, but I've never thought about what any of it means. And as he began the transformation toward becoming an imam, as he began to become the teacher and not just the student, one of his starting points with an advanced class of Quran studies was to take a verse out of the Quran and say, what does it mean? And he found that none of his students had any idea what it meant because they had studied it without having thought about it. So he went back to the drawing board with them about studying, about thinking. He went back to the beginning of the beginning. He said, by the way, what's the point of knowledge? What is the point of studying? And none of them could answer that. So what Gulen was engaged in already with his students at an early stage in his life was a dialogue of a Socratic sort in the purest sense, that his interest was not in instructing them as much as in pulling them into a process of instructing themselves, of thinking for themselves, of examining and exploring. Socrates referred to himself as a midwife of ideas. They're already inside you. You're pregnant with the ability to come up with thoughts he would just help facilitate the process of bringing them out. And this is what Gulen began to engage in. And it did not take him long, in fact, to realize and to recognize that the world, in fact, is broader and deeper even than all the material that he encompassed and encountered within Islam. So he became interested in, and he began to read and learn about Socrates and Plato, to learn about other religious traditions, to learn about science. He became enormously interested in the world of modernity and its science, following another model, Said Nursi, an important Turkish Muslim thinker who was a generation and a half older than Gulen, who saw a whole range of interfaces between passages in the Quran and what had been happening in modernity with the development of science. But Gulen looked, for example, to someone like Einstein, and Einstein's thinking about the universe, and Einstein's thinking about the relationship between science and religion, whereby Einstein, the consummate physicist, the consummate character whom one might suppose at first glance probably has no time for God because he's looking at the universe based on the notion of hydrogen atoms and the like. But Einstein was very clear that science and religion are a partnership. Science can tell you what is, he writes in 2 essays in the 1940s. Religion tells you what should be. Or in practical terms, science can tell me that if I spill all this stuff on my lawn, it's going to kill the weeds. But it will also tell me that what I spill will soak into the ground and poison the aquifer, making the water not as good for my children, for my neighbors. Science tells me that. Religion tells me, so should I or should I not use this weed killer? It's what informs me with the moral question of what I should, or I should not do. So Gulen, if you follow his career in the 80s, is very much focused on Turkey and on Islam. He sees Turkey as a country that has lost its way because by virtue of the rigorous manner in which Ataturk had shaped the new state as a secular state, religion was no longer not only part of the picture, it was pushed out of the picture. And so centuries and centuries of Islam were left behind. And he saw in the youth of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and this was true across the planet, not just in Turkey, a kind of nihilistic being lost, not knowing where we are. That era of revolutions, with all of its positive aspects, because it led to people thinking about things they should have been thinking about all along and had not, also had as a kind of negative repercussion or a negative basis, a loss of a sense of where I fit into the world in a really positive way. And he saw that for Turkey. So his interest in instruction, his interest in becoming an imam, was to try and fix that problem. So it wasn't just that he gave a khutbah, kind of sermon, at the Friday noon services, but he followed that with a sohbet, with a discussion that involved questions and answers. And he began to do this not just in the mosque, but he would go into coffee houses because that's where people were hanging out. That's where people who didn't come to the mosque ever were hanging out. And he would engage in dialogues, in discussions, in questions and answer. Any question you want, he would try to answer on any subject. So he very quickly developed this enormous reputation, first in Izmir, which is where his primary first position was as an imam, Turkey's third largest city. He developed a reputation as someone who was different, as someone who really cared about people, and as someone who had a broad and deep range of knowledge that there was no question within the context of Islam that he could not address intelligently, but also that there was no question well beyond the bounds of Islam that he was not comfortable discussing. Or if he didn't have the answer, was not comfortable saying, I'm not sure about that. Let me think about, or let me read about this. Let me come back to you with an answer. So he was engaged in an ongoing dialogue. And the dialogue was very much, if I can again mix my historical metaphors, an I thou dialogue. So that when at a certain point, he began to gain a critical mass of followers, and he began to think of ways to reach out beyond where I am now. I mean, after all, there's one Fethullah Gulen, and here I am as Fethullah Gulen in this one mosque, in this one coffee house at this one time speaking. But if the kinds of issues that are being raised here are obviously issues that people all over Turkey are going to have, then how can that get out? So aside from the issue that people began to make tapes of his discussions, and they began to be disseminated across Western, then across Turkey, and then Turkey in general, he began to think about how we could shape educational institutions within Turkey that would provide the basis for young Turks to engage the world on all levels. So that what began to evolve as a school system associated with inspiration from Fethullah Gulen was a school system that discussed everything from physics and chemistry to literature and history to fine arts to sports. The body, the mind, the body in its totality. The only thing that the schools associated with him did not teach is religion, because this would be contrary to the laws of a secular Turkey. He also began to think about all of those who would benefit from but had no access to schools like these. So developed a program where some kid from Eastern Turkey could come, let's say, to Izmir, to a school, and have a place to stay that would be safe. They started to call them, they used the word darsana, which out of Arabic really, it means a school, but it had the implication of light, a lighthouse. So places, dormitories where someone coming from outside without a lot of resources could come and stay and be mentored by those who were a few years older who had already been through the system, whom they were referred to as Abi in the masculine or Abla in the feminine, an older brother, an older sister. And this expanding, extraordinary system of educational opportunity that would address the whole realm of Turkey. But this initial sensibility for Gulen, which was Turcocentric and Islamocentric, that gradually spread to Turkic countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and so on, countries in, so to say, the vicinity, with a somewhat similar, how shall I call it, ethno-religious background, where that was an initial focus of his. He reached a point where he realized, but that's not it. If the world is to survive, it can't be just about Turkey. It can't be just about Muslims. It's got to be about all countries, all nations. It's got to be about all religions. It's got to move beyond. It has to be humanocentric, not Islamocentric or Turcocentric. And by the end of the 90s, his interest was in dialogue of an interfaith sort, of a multicultural sort, of an international sort. He was able to engage in direct conversations with Pope John Paul II, with the chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel, with the head of the Anglican Church in England, so that the array of relationships, of I-thou style relationships that he forged grew and grew and grew. So that for Gulen, the notion of dialogue evolved to become, and that's what he has taught, and that's what he has preached, and that's what he's been writing now for over 20 years, is precisely coming full circle, the kind of dialogue that is implicit in what Buber wrote about, in what Socrates talked about and Plato wrote about, what Ibn Arabi and Rumi certainly wrote about, and that is considering all of us and considering how all of us are best served by being in relationship with all of us. So dialogue, genuine dialogue, and again, that's the challenge, genuine dialogue. It is to be engaged with those of other faiths, of other ethnicities, of other nationalities, of other races, of other whatever term you want to use to identify someone as other than what you are, of other genders, in which your position is one of equilibrious reciprocity between yourself and the other, and that other and yourself. Of course, where Fethullah Gulen is concerned, where Hoj Effendi is concerned, as you probably are already aware, it's not only a matter of dialogue, or I should put it a different way. How do you reach the point of being able to engage in dialogue in the first place? How do you reach out? How do you find all those other people? And the answer is, you can't hide behind the doors of the school. Yes, you want to go out and you want to create educational institutions that are vast and diverse, that give enormous numbers of individuals the opportunity to engage in the thinking processes, engaging these various disciplines, seeing how they interweave, seeing how they interact, and become each and every one of them, therefore, aspects of an expanding web of dialogue. But that in and of itself is doing and not just talking. And so the idea that comes about by way of the term in Turkish hizmet, which means service, is serving others. That means not just schools, it means social services, it means hospitals. It means at a practical level, gathering in the way humans in particular, when they interact in a positive way, are wont to gather, and that is food. Let's face it, no place is more comfortable for starting to relax and converse with people than the dining room table. When you're all enjoying food, you're more likely to be less formal, more relaxed, and more willing to have conversations. Of course, the conversations can go off the tracks. This happens. Notoriously, in American households, Thanksgiving is a dangerous time. Everyone loves it, looks forward to it. And then the families come in and they end up having arguments from childhood that emerge now when they're in their 50s. But as an ideal, meals are an optimal kind of opportunity. So the Hizmet movement reaching out by creating the wherewithal for meals. Well, one would be a logical context. Iftar dinners, for example. So if there's a whole month, the month of Ramadan in the Muslim tradition, that is marked, among other things, by a meal that is inherently special because I've been fasting from sunrise to sunset. So by the time I finally get to my first meal of the day, which is at dinner time, at supper time, I'm starving. It's a special meal. So to invite others in, others from different traditions, not because we're showing off what we do at iftar, but because we're sharing together food that makes possible a conversation among us. So the combination of doing and acting in all kinds of directions becomes part of what I should call a multivalent polylog. It's not a dialogue, that's between two, a polylog among many, and multivalent because at different levels that are verbal and nonverbal. My favorite story of how this notion of words, thoughts, and actions play out in a Hizmet context that involves a school is this. It's a school I visited in Sydney, Australia. And the 11th and 12th graders were tasked in that school because there was a fair amount of open space beyond the building. They created a garden and they were growing a substantial number of organic vegetables, right? So first of all, they were coming to understand it was the students who were responsible. The teachers aren't doing this for you guys. You have to figure this out for yourselves. We'll guide you, we'll mentor you, but you got to figure it out. They became aware in an intimate way that they might not otherwise have had. I mean, these are kids, they're city kids. What do they know about what a farmer goes through in order to create the food that ends up in the store where you buy it, then goes to your table? You had nothing to do with the process of creating it. Suddenly they have become intimate with that process. And it's healthy stuff. And it turns out that in and around Sydney, organic vegetables are not easily come by. So the second part of the project was that they would sell the organic vegetables to their neighbors, in the area around the school, who are happy to have access to organic vegetables. And the third part is, so they're getting an understanding of how the world works in terms of the value of stuff and what people are willing to pay for this or that or what have you. But the third part of the project is, so now what are they doing with that money that they have earned? Well, of course, a little bit of it is going to go in to buy the seeds to create the next crop. But the majority of it is being sent to Africa. And the year I was there, I think it was Ghana, to a community that had very little access to fresh water. So it was to provide the wherewithal for the project that was digging a well and creating new sources of fresh water for that community. So the outcome of the garden, ultimately, in the third phase, or the third aspect of it, is that it's going to help this community, which is thousands of miles away, mind you, to better itself, to dig its own well, to create the pipe system from the well to the community that the community itself is doing, but with an assist from this community that is way, way, way far away. Another kind of dialogue, you might say, a dialogue of mutual understanding. So in the end, Hizmet, in its multivalent dialogue, which is a dialogue not only of words and of understanding, but of actions and understanding that carry from education to social to all kinds of ways of being in the world, is a reality that perceives that the future of humanity, the future of the planet, is ultimately what all this is about. If we cannot be engaged in this kind of multivalent dialogue with its aspects, then we're all at risk. I'll add a kind of codicil to that. If you study the history of revolutions, one of the things that comes out again and again and again is this. If the revolution is about me, it's about my group that is suppressed or oppressed or repressed, so we want to throw off the oppressors, but it's only about my group, then it's a revolution that is doomed to fail. It's only if the revolutionary has in mind the idea that it's not just my group that requires liberation, but that everybody requires liberation, that will in the long run succeed. And Hizmet and its concept of dialogue is indeed a revolution that is trying to see all of humanity engaged in a way that promotes the future of humanity and the future of the planet. So I'm open to questions or comments or discussions.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this very interesting and refreshing talk. I couldn't imagine Buber's and Socrates, type of dialogue leading to Hizmet's perspective. So it's a first for me. So thank you so much for it. Now we open the floor for questions and answers.
Pragya has a question.
Yes, Pragya has one. Pragya, please go ahead.
I actually have a comment rather than a question, especially because I think the lecture was quite self-explanatory, very easy to understand. So I don't have any questions as such right now, but my comment was on the last line when you talked about the, how revolutions, they have to be multidimensional, like educational, social, religious, everything. So even when we look at the Indian independence, the leaders, they ensured that the revolution was not just happening against the British colonialism, but also in our culture, in terms of they try to or change untouchability, which was the lower caste. They were treated badly, and other things. So I think, and also education. So we used to have these religious organizations in India, own. So I think that there has to be more of that just struck me, because I would have just seen more a single track, and now I'm suddenly, it's just like my vision has just kind of been broadened by this lecture.
Thank you so much, Pragya. I hope I heard everything, because you were breaking up a little bit there toward the end, but I'm sure you're aware of the fact that Gandhi, his vision, of course, was a diverse India. And what he hoped for with independence was a multidimensional India. He did not want it to be broken into what became India and two Pakistans and so on and so forth. And those who fought against that principle were those who more narrowly conceived of, we need to have this space for a Muslim majority, and we need to have this space for a Hindu majority. And then I don't have to tell you all the consequent exchange of populations in order to make India more Hindu and Pakistan more Muslim led to violence and so on. Within that violence was, of course, the assassination, ultimately, the assassination of Gandhi himself was a function of that. The one who shot him, right, was a nationalist whose view of Gandhi was that he is thinking too broadly, and that's dangerous. And you could not be more right. It was the matter of religious diversity, because India's long history of religious diversity, the Indian subcontinent, I'll call it, because I don't mean India in the narrow sense of what is geopolitically India today, is rather extraordinary. I guess it's my most recent book that came out about 4 months ago is called Growing Up Jewish in India. And what inspired it is the art of an artist by the name of Siona Benjamin, who is from Mumbai. So she grew up among Muslims and Hindus. They were her friends. She went to Catholic and Parsi schools, Zoroastrian schools. She came to America to study art, ended up staying, and her art not only reflects a diversity of influences, but she sees it as an instrument of promoting multicultural, international, interfaith, et cetera, kind of thinking. And the community in which she grew up and the community into which Jews as a very small group arrived and then remained over the centuries was a community that was embracing of them, because it was already a diverse community, not only in terms of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and so on, but as I suggested a moment back, Hinduism is a kind of misnomer, because we've got Vaishnavism, we've got Krishnaism, we've got Brahmanism, and so on and so forth. And the thing is, if as a Krishnite, I believe that Krishna is the consummate manifestation of God, as expressed in the Gita, that doesn't mean that I believe that you who believe that Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu and that Vishnu is the consummate manifestation, that I'm going to go to war with you over it. We find no problem with that kind of coexistent paradox. And alas, of course, India today, like so many other countries across the planet, including recently the one in which I dwell, the United States, is challenging its own identity by virtue of the kind of narrow-minded nationalism that its leadership is now pushing toward. But yes, if it's not about all of us, in the end, it's not about any of us. Both on the, this is just a religious front, but you also brought up the social front, the socioeconomic front. And Gandhi, of course, pushed hard against the elimination of a caste thinking that included a caste of what in English we call untouchables. His view was it's got to be about all of us. We all pull ourselves up together. Anyway, thank you for your comment, Pragya. Rajan, do you want to be next, and then Sakshi?
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I really enjoyed your lecture. Sir, my question is that, I have been frequently asking this question throughout the whole course, which we are, discussing. My question is that, sir, when we are discussing the skill of learning dialogue, do we really need the religious foundation, or can we have a secular foundation of learning the dialogue skill? What should be the foundation of,
Yes.
dialogue?
No,
what
religion.
should be the
Very good question, Rajan. Very good question.
Let me give you some example. Like when we are discussing the idea of dialogue, what should be the subject matter of dialogue? Like justice, equality, fraternity, liberty, and so on. What does religion have to do with it? When we, start discussing the idea of dialogue, automatically by, personal biases or, due to some reason, we somehow input the religious content, interfaith, interreligious, and so on. So, like, why does it, in such kind of consistency we human have been following in one way or another? Can we have a secular notion of dialogue? This is the first question. My second question is that, sir, can we have a case study or a model regarding Afghanistan? Recently some Afghan leaders went to European Union. They wanted to discuss the Afghanistan position. They went for dialogue. They discussed something. I don't know what they discussed. Do you think that their dialogue are going to help the Afghanistan situation in whatever whatever condition they are? So these are two questions I want to ask. Thank you.
Sure. So in answer to the first question, dialogue does not have to be about religion. It doesn't have to involve religion. It obviously can involve politics. It can involve culture. It can involve socioeconomics. Religion happens to be, and for whatever reasons, seems to have particularly emerged over the last couple of decades as an area not only of conflict on the one hand, but in which there is an increasing interest, I suppose, to have a dialogue because religion so distinctly addresses a reality beyond our own, God. And oddly enough, well, let me put it to you this way. The history of religion is always this, always. It begins with revelation. It begins with the sense that a particular group has that its concept of divinity has revealed itself to and through an individual or a series of individuals. We might call them prophets, but there are other terms we could use. But once those individuals are gone, we're left with the words that they've left behind that then we have to understand, we have to interpret. So whether it is, let's say, Moses, who brings down from the mountain these commandments, at a certain point he's gone, or Muhammad, who spends 22 years between his first experience of revelation on Mount Hira in 610 and his death in 632, experiencing God's presence and preaching and teaching about the things that come through him to his constituents. He's gone after 632. So the constituents of Moses and the constituents of Muhammad, and obviously I can multiply this across the planet to any number of individuals and their groups, then have to figure out what the words meant, which are not always necessarily clear. Let me give you two examples, very clear examples, from the words associated with Moses. So there is a series of commandments, one of which, the sixth, says, "Thou shalt not commit murder." And the question then becomes for me, what does it mean to commit murder? And I don't mean only if you attack me and I defend myself and I kill you, did I just commit murder, or is that not murder? Or if I am engaged as a soldier presumably protecting my homeland against yours, and so I go out and I'm killing you who are a soldier on the other side, is that murder? But what if a mosquito lands on me and I swat it because I don't want to get bitten by the mosquito? Oh my gosh, did I just commit murder? So we have to figure out what murder means and not just assume we know. Let me ratchet up the complication another turn. In the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, we have the story of Noah and the flood. And that story starts out with the following verse, and I'm probably not quoting it exactly correctly. All the people of the world had become evil, so the Lord purposed to destroy them, except for Noah, who was a righteous man in his generation, da-da-da-da-da-da. So we end up with this story in which God destroys all of humanity, except for Noah and his family. They build this enormous boat, and they gather in a certain number of animals and their own family to that. So there is the wherewithal to start again after the flood has ended. But the point is, Rajan, what does evil mean? And we realize nowhere does it say what all of those humans were doing that was so evil that God decided to destroy them all. And I page back through chapter 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's nothing that tells me what evil means. So I have two ways of thinking about this. One is, Moses wasn't listening carefully and God must have said, and Moses just, he scratched his eye at that moment and didn't notice and didn't write it down. Or the very intention of there being no definition is to obligate us forever and ever and ever and ever to constantly be asking the question of what constitutes evil. Okay? So the problematic of religion is its whole history of interpretation. And the problematic within the problematic is when I've determined that my interpretation is the only acceptable one, so I'm starting to treat it as if it's revelation. And I forget that it's only interpretation. And you know what? You disagree with me, I'll kill you for it. That becomes a bit of a problem, but it's coming out of my ego. So the dialogue process is about trying to ramp down that ego-laden sense of, I know what it's about. All I need to do, the only thing I have to recognize is, I'm completely comfortable that my interpretation is perfect for me, but recognize that it is an interpretation. I could be wrong. You could be right, but let's just settle that you're right for you and I'm right for me, and they can coexist. But here's the thing. This is still about religion. Obviously, this could be the same in politics. It could be the same in any number of other disciplines. It's just that historically, particularly in the West, less so in the East, so much blood has been spilled in the name of God, in the name of divinity, because of religion, that's certainly a place where I think of dialogue is very important. One of the things that Gulen has said, in fact, it was in a comment in the conversation, because like Besad, I'd had the opportunity to meet him a couple of times. One of the things he said was, even atheists who are doing good works are doing God's work, even though they don't know it. So you don't have to be religious. You can be a secularist. In fact, I'm quite offended at the notion that the only way I can be a moral person is because I believe in God, because if I don't believe in God, somehow I can't be ethical. I believe that's baloney. I can be a complete secular atheist and still be a moral and ethical person, just as I can be a very religious person and not be moral and ethical. Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Modi are instances of individuals who consider themselves and would like to represent themselves as pious, the one a Muslim, the other a Hindu. They are not moral people, from where I stand at least. So that's my long-winded answer to your first question. And as for the second, I don't know, because I don't know enough detail about what the conversation was between the Afghanis and the members of the EU. But it certainly can't hurt. When Turkey wanted to join the EU at the time, one of the blocks I saw in that process was that I was not convinced that the leadership of the EU was sufficiently non-Islamophobic to allow Turkey into the EU. At this point, I'm still fairly convinced that that's correct, but I also believe that Erdogan's position was far from what he was representing it publicly as being. So that may also have been part of the problem. And certainly, none of this has been resolved yet. And the problem of Afghanistan is not resolved yet. But it can't hurt to have had that conversation, but I don't know details enough to really answer it effectively. Sakshi, you're next. And Saim? Yes, you are. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So the session was extremely insightful, and which led me to question things about human evolution. So there was a line where you said that science tells what it is, but religion tells what it should be.
Yes.
So when I read this line, I feel a sense of realist and idealist situation over here. I can differentiate that science is a realist space and religion could be an idealist situation. But sir, my question here is that we have seen science being the cause of war many times. You might also see it in the near future for space that we are talking about right now.
Yes.
We have also seen religion being the cause of war various of times, be in active or in passive way. Now that both of them are complementing each other and helping each other during war and also to rise up to raise a war, so how can we justify their functioning now? How can we say that both of them are functioning in such a way? And sir, my second question is there something beyond science and religion which we as a human are not able to see? Or war is meant to be happen in situation like this?
Yes. Of course, Einstein, he's writing, I think it's 1942, he's writing in the middle of World War II. He's writing in the middle of the Holocaust. And he is thinking in and writing in ideal terms, in the ideal reality that he envisions. As he says, science, all that science can do is tell you what is. All that science can do is tell you that if you pour that chemical on the grass, the weeds will die, or that if you can create atomic fission, you can produce energy, and it can be used in all kinds of ways. Religion, in an ideal, in his sense, is the discipline that can and should instruct you into not what is, but how to be, so therefore what should be. It's to provide a moral guide. So here's the problem that you well recognize. It's true, on the one hand, that science has been the source not only of obviously wonderful things, penicillin, the polio vaccine, and so on and so forth. It has provided all kinds of pluses for our ability to exist on the planet. But alas, it has also provided the minuses. So in the wrong hands or the right hands or somebody's hands, it's created the atomic bomb and all of its concomitants, or more advanced guns and whatever you're talking about, that of course are detrimental to human existence. The religion, as Einstein sees it, as an instrument for providing moral guidance, hasn't always played that role, far from it in human history. And that comes back to, from where I sit, it comes back to the problem of human ego. It comes back to the way in which religion and politics have always been interwoven with each other, so that instead of my being guided to operate this way, I end up being pushed to operate that way. I don't know that there's something beyond that. Obviously, a secularist, the secularists, I'm right now engaged in a written dialogue with 3 different atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, because of a book that I'm finishing writing called The Problem of God. And it kind of discusses the various ways across time and space in which humans have thought about the concept of divinity and why we think about divinity in the first place, what religion is all about. And one of the things that I have found interesting in the writing so far of Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens, actually all three of them, is they claim to be talking about God, but they're actually talking about religion, which is to say they're not talking about God, they're talking about how humans have thought about and acted on their beliefs in God. So religion and religious wars, as a consequence of religion, are of course not about God, they're about what humans have thought about God and their willingness to act based on what they think in violent ways. So in the West, the age of religious wars, let's say, between Protestants and Catholics, between about 1550 and 1715, or the era of the Crusades, between Christians and Muslims. These are instances, and there are only two, of course, among many, where religion is in the service of politics and ego. When Urban II declares the First Crusade in 1095, the alleged grounds are because the Seljuks, who have embraced Islam, who now control much of the region of the Middle East, are, according to him, making it impossible for Christian pilgrims to go to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the like. And so therefore, the Muslim infidel, and note the word, they have no faith because their faith isn't ours. That's what infidel means. Fid is a Latin root meaning faith. So infidel means faithless. So the Muslim infidel, faithless because their faith is not ours, needs to be pushed out of the region so that Christians can more freely go to Jerusalem. And when Jerusalem, by the way, is taken in 1099, one of the leaders of the Christian Crusaders, Geoffrey of Bouillon, writes ebulliently how the blood of Muslims and Jews is flowing through the streets of Jerusalem up to the haunches of my horse, with pride at the violence that he was enacting. But here's the thing, Urban II was concerned about the fact that the nobility was pushing back against his authority as the Pope. It was about his authority. If I can redirect all of that energy, that male energy, away from me, away from here within Christendom where I want to be the guy in charge, out towards them, and them now becomes the Muslims, and I promise to these guys, you go on crusade carrying the cross to the Holy Land, I can guarantee you, so he's presuming to speak as if in God's words, right? I can guarantee you a quicker passage to heaven. So he is, how shall I put it, Sakshi? He's manipulating the shape of his religion in accordance with his particular political ego needs. So that is, again and again in the history of religion, a problem. So that also comes back to the previous question, to Rajan's question. Is dialogue only about religion? No, not at all. But it's certainly an important part of what, as a species, we have to deal with, because we have such a long history right up to the present day of misconstruing the idea of connecting ourselves to divinity with connecting ourselves to our own ego, our own political needs, and using the idea of divinity as an instrument to further those needs. I don't know if I've really answered your question, because I don't know if I haven't answered the question. But I don't know that there's something else beyond science and religion. Of course, there are other subsets, but they all relate to each other. Other instruments by which we as humans operate, right? Whether it's words, or whether it's music, or whether it's dance, or whether it is visual art, all those are different instruments, and all those instruments have very much been used as instruments to help religion do what it does, which is to deal with divinity. Next, Simon.
That was a very insightful session. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, fine. So basically, my question was when I began to read Gulen's article, it began with that the world is abounding in misery. Everywhere there is misery, everywhere there is pain, and people are asking questions. When I read this statement, I was reminded of the colonial history that everywhere things have happened without dialogue. Most of the injustice has happened without dialogue. The Aborigines were not asked, the Red Indians were not taken into the dialogue, and still when we think of interfaith dialogue, we're not thinking of tribal religions. I don't see much of the dialogue happening with tribal religions or tribal people or paganism, sort of. And
Yeah.
I'm also directed towards thinking, it's just a comment, it's just a comment. I'm also directed towards thinking that how Balfour Declaration has happened without dialogue and how Trump can pull out of the JCPOA without dialogues. So when most of the things, miseries in the world happen without dialogue because the powerful has this, this position of misusing the power anytime and surprisingly, shockingly. So can dialogue ever undo what has been done without dialogue?
Ah,
As a sort of a comment.
yeah. Well, that's a tough question. Right now, the United States is in the middle of living with that question because so many of the things that Mr. Trump did, and you just mentioned one, right? Without dialogue, by fiat, his vision of himself is not as the elected president of the United States, but as the selected emperor of the United States. And we're wrestling with whether or not we can undo some of what he has done. And it is, as I don't need to tell you, very much a challenge. So I don't know whether in the long run it will or will not be. Ideally and theoretically, sure, by nature, a system like the American system is such where you have these turnovers every 4 years that make it feasible. On the other hand, you have an instrument called the Supreme Court, whose members serve for life. And if they are of a particular political bent, as much as that court is supposed to be above politics, current configuration is not. So that offers a genuine threat to the possibility of undoing with dialogue what has been done without dialogue. In a situation such as that you symbolize by the Balfour Declaration or the Balfour Statement of 1917, the fact of the matter is in the 1990s, in the aftermath of Oslo in 1993, there was an ongoing dialogue that was, I think, on the verge and on the edge of perhaps resolving or resulting in the resolution of what was, of course, a very, very long conflict. And alas, another truism of history is that the assassination of the right person in the right time in the right place can really derail things. Had Gandhi not been killed, who knows where things might have evolved further in a more positive way in the India-Pakistan relationship. Had Yitzhak Rabin not been assassinated, I believe that it's likely that we'd be talking today about Israel-Palestine as two peaceful neighbors instead of the mess that we are still in, that, as long as you mentioned him, Trump has only increased, or he's now gone, but had only increased by a non-dialogue unilateral decision with respect to Jerusalem, for example, okay? But by the way, the Israel-Palestine issue is one where the dialogue question is more complex than just Israel-Palestine. I don't need to tell you that somewhat analogous to what was once two Pakistans, which only resolved itself when one became Bengali, Bangladesh, and the other Pakistan. So you did not have one country separated by another in its two parts. I believe the same issue will exist with Gaza and the West Bank. And I believe, therefore, that there should be two Palestines and not one. But also what underlies my conviction is that one is operating under Hamas and the other under the Palestinian Authority. And they are rarely in positive dialogue with each other. So they would do better as separate entities, but that's another story for another day. My point is only to suggest that I do believe that dialogue can undo things that have happened without dialogue, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. Next, Akansha.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insights. So my question is I'll say it's not that difficult as compared to how Rajan questioned or Sakshi or Pragya questioned. So through the session, I got to know that to bring in any idea into reality, we need three things. The example which you gave of the Australian school, like team, structure, and infrastructure. I agree to that. And along with that, we need an upper hand of communication and positive dialogue. That's for sure, because that would drive the wagon of ours. But so how to protect the inertia or the zeal which we have during the initial phase? Because in the long run, we see that diversity and the differences, the multiculturalism, or I'm talking on the global level, the xenophobia which we are facing, or genocides which are happening right now, the north-south divide. So how to protect that progressive communication in the long run? Because we are talking about dialogue and communication in the context of the welfare of the society as a whole. So
Yeah.
How to protect and how to bring in consistency in that?
Yeah. I wish I had a simple answer for that. When I look at the world today, I'm reminded of where the world was in the 1930s, you know, where there was a whole series of individuals who were tyrannical autocrats, whatever terms you want to use. And I look around, and this was certainly the case, is certainly the case in Turkey. It's the case in India. It's the case in Hungary. It's the case in Poland. It's the case in Brazil. I'm not sure about Israel. It certainly was the case when Netanyahu was still in power. One of my happiest moments was when he was removed from power, but they certainly have not arrived at a kind of resolution of their issues internally or vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The Philippines, I mean, the list, Alaska goes on. And of course, for 4 years, no question, the United States. So in the 1930s, the United States was still this kind of beacon. You know, if you could get there, which it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to do, you could get away from all of that horror. But by 2016, we have become part of the problem and not a solution to that problem, which, as you can imagine, makes me despair more than a little bit. Of course, I was thrilled when Trump was removed from office a year ago, but I've seen, and this is a little bit, it's not quite the same as Saim's question about dialogue fixing things that were done without dialogue, but it runs on a parallel track. In the United States, the political picture hasn't changed since Trump was removed from office. And one side of the political fence is enormously hostile to the other and unwilling to work with the other, whereas traditionally, for the most part, most of the time, there was at least a modicum of working, as they say in the Congress, what is it they say, across the aisle, that's the phrase they use, across the aisle, which made it possible, well, for someone like Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s and 40s to create infrastructures that had a positive outcome for more Americans and for more of the world. I don't know, Akansha, whether how it's doable. I mean, theoretically, the answer is obvious. You Indians have to vote Modi out of office. We have to vote out of office the people who are, let's say broadly, anti-dialogue, you know, and the Brazilians have to do the same, and the Poles have to do the same, and the Israelis have to do the same. But the problem is, you said communication. The problem is, it seems that some of these characters are sufficiently in control of the ability to communicate to the vast majority of people, that the vast majority of people vote against their own interests. The people who support Trump, not only could he not care about them, what he would have the world be would destroy them. and they don't even realize it, you know? And clearly that's the same in Brazil, and that's the same in India, and it's the same, well, in Turkey, it's too late now because Erdogan now controls everything. So even if, in theory, the people wanted to vote against him, they have no wherewithal to do so. And that comes back to this question of violence. Is the only answer violent revolution? Well, I don't want to advocate violent revolution. I guess, not to be silly about it, we come back to, well, back to Socrates and Plato, where I began, and we have to keep thinking about these things. We have to keep asking these questions. We have to keep trying to find solutions rather than either thinking, okay, I know the answer, or sort of sitting back and saying, it's okay, you know, someone else will deal with it. And that's what Hizmet is about, right? It's about not saying someone else will deal with it. It's about being in the trenches. Hizmet people walk the walk, they don't just talk the talk. So to the extent that all of us are walking the walk and not just talking the talk, to the extent that what you guys are getting out of this class ends up resulting in your becoming active in one way, shape, or form, and I don't know which way, shape, or form, to trying to improve the world around you. And don't worry about the whole world. Start with the small piece of which you're part, you know? How can I improve the condition of my community? If my community seems, how can I reach out from my community to the next couple of communities? And ultimately, you know, it becomes all of India, the world, and so on. It's both simple and, of course, it's not simple at all. I don't want to sound, as I said, silly, but it seems to me, you know, short of just freezing in despair, this is the kind of path. I can only speak for myself, right? I can only speak for myself. So part of what I see myself doing as a potential instrument for helping to improve the world is the teaching that I do. And I teach in a school where I have no idea what the repercussions of things that I say to different students might be, and where that might lead because of who they are. You know, years ago, this is probably 10, 12 years ago, a student comes up to me before midterm break and he says, "Professor, I'm going to be back a little bit late after midterm break because I have to help my father. He's running for Prime Minister of Greece and I have to help his campaign." Right? Or another student of mine, he was taking a course on Jewish mysticism. I usually teach Jewish, Christian, Muslim mysticism, but this was just Jewish mysticism. And this kid was from Jordan. His name was Hussein, right? Well, Hussein is a very common surname in the Arab world, so I didn't think anything of it, although that was the name of the then king of Jordan, but I didn't think anything of it. A year later, I had an occasion to visit Jordan, and I happened to run across this kid on campus, and I said, "Oh, you know, I was in your country," and we had a brief conversation, and we're starting to turn away, and then he stops and said, "Professor, please let me know if you go back to Jordan because I could, you know, introduce you to people who would be very interesting for you." Well, my uncle's the king. So my point is, I happen to teach at a school where there are, not everyone's like that, but I have students like that who potentially, therefore, if I am helping them think about these things, will be in a position more easily than I would, or you perhaps would, when they go out into the world to not just think about and talk about, but to make things happen. But even you and I, obviously, can make things happen, if perhaps on a smaller scale than someone who is the nephew of the king of Jordan, or someone whose father is running for Prime Minister of Greece, and so on and so forth. So that's another every answer I've given to every question has been a non-answer answer. But that's how it goes.
Thank you so much, sir. So I got to know that small is the key. Small is the key, be it you're living in the ancient time or the medieval or the modern. Small is the key, and that will bring the end result. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And I think I have to go, Behzad, because I actually have classes to teach.
Thank you so much for your time. It was a brilliant session, and we had a very healthy discussion too. Thank you so much. Pleasure listening to you.
Well, thank you all very much. And I hope to be able to visit your school one of these days. I hope to be back in India. I was there very briefly, but just in Mumbai a couple of times, just before COVID. So we'll see, but it will be wonderful. And to meet some of you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll see, but it will be wonderful. And to meet some of you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.